Hello Year 11, this is our second lesson on the demographic transition model and population pyramids and how they relate to each other and also how we can relate them to development over time. So this picks up at exactly the point that we left off, whether you were already isolating or you've only just started to. So we'll do a quick recap first. So this is the sheet you are needing to fill in lessons. So here's our demographic transition model showing our total population changing over time and development, our death rate and our birth rate, and going through those stages. And in the table you were just filling it in with descriptions of what was happening, examples of real life places, and finally we were putting in those population pyramids to show what shape the population structure was like at any one of those stages. And if you remember, population pyramids, they simply split the population of a place into gender, so we've got male and female, and we've got age groups, and we can just read off those percentages just like you could do a bar chart. And we said things like a really wide base that's getting wider shows a large birth rate. If we've got a top that's thin, then we've got a higher death rate or a lower life expectancy, which is what we would expect in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Whereas in Germany, we've got the opposite happening. It's a well-developed, wealthy country. We've got a falling birth rate, as shown by these insides here of the bottom getting thinner. And we have got a very wide top showing lots of people living to an old age, as we would expect for a country with good access to food, good access to healthcare. And what you needed to do was these different population pyramids here, you needed to match that up to your table, and it should have looked something like this. So we've got a matchup happening with these population pyramids where we can see for stage 1 and stage 2 where our birth rate is high, we've got a really wide bottom. And also the sides are going in quickly because we've got a high death rate. And here where the death rate is falling, but it's still, reasonably high, we've got a slightly less steep. Here where the birth rate is beginning to go down, our sides are becoming straighter, they're not sticking out so much. And because that death rate is really coming down, the top is starting to get wider because we've got more old people. And we can see that situation increasing through stage 4, where the birth rate, it's really beginning to go down. We've got the sides coming in here, and that middle part is really quite wide. And then finally stage 5, where we have actually got, we can see the sides here going in really steeply, showing that idea of a natural decrease and a really wide top because our death rate is again so low and we're getting lots of people living to an old age. So just make sure that on your table, if I just scroll back up to it, okay, on your table here you have just sketched in those population pyramids correctly so you know how the shape matches up to the stage. Okay, so now we're going to get on to our new learning, and on these slides in the green boxes it's going to show you what you need to do in your notes. Okay, so on this slide you need to write out this information. So we're going to talk about something called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio of a population shows you the amount of that population that's not in work. So children aged 0 to 15 and those above 64. And it's called the dependency ratio because those people are dependent on those who are working and have got jobs and are generating money and creating tax revenue for the country, because that tax revenue is paying for things like schooling and roads to be built and pensions and healthcare. So we've got a list of countries here, okay? The dependency ratio is shown as a percentage. So what I want you to do is just think to yourself and try and get written down what dependency ratio you think these different countries have got, okay? So these aren't in the right order. So have a go at that, pause the video, and we'll show you the answers in just a moment. So here are the answers for you, and we can see the country with the biggest dependency ratio is Niger. The UK is at 34%, so way less than Niger with 53%. And then we've got Brazil down with 31%. And the challenge question I'd like you to have a go at here is to explain why Niger and Japan have got these high dependency ratios, because they're for completely different reasons. Niger, which is a country that's got quite a low life expectancy, it's a poor country, their dependency ratio is so large because there are a lot of children in that country. A lot of the population of Niger are sort of below the age of 30. They're having children. There isn't great access to contraceptives. There is a culture whereby people get married early and they have lots of children. So a lot of that 53% is young people. And that's a really difficult thing for Niger to deal with, because those young children all need educating, they all need healthcare. And when you're a poorer country and you've not got so many people working and you've not got the wealth going through to the government, it's very hard for the government to supply that education and that healthcare to everybody who needs it. Japan is at the other end of the scale. Japan is a very wealthy country. It's got very good healthcare and a very healthy lifestyle. People eat healthy food. So a lot of that 49% is older people, because people are living to such an old age and they're drawing their pensions. And again, that's difficult for Japan, because what it means is if a lot of the population are old and not working, they're not producing money. And again, old people cost money. They might need hospital care, they might need help in their homes, they might be suffering from dementia or some kind of physical disability that means that they need people to look after them. So lots of young people or lots of old people in a population can become quite a burden on the taxpayers, on the workers. France, UK, USA, Brazil, they have got a more balanced population, as we can see. So about a third of the population are dependents. But for countries like the UK and France, that figure is getting bigger as our birth rates continue to drop and people are living longer and longer lives. So we'll start to see this move upwards and maybe be a bit more of a reflection of what it is like in Japan. So now that I've explained that, have a go at answering that challenge question in your notes, please. Okay, so what we need to do on this slide is have a go at answering these questions. And we've got here a graph showing what is happening in Kenya in 1945 to 2000. And we can see we've got the birth rate, we've got the death rate, and we have got the total population. So the first question is asking us at A, why is it that the population is still rising even though the birth rate is dropping? Because if the birth rate is dropping, you might think logically that should mean that the population is going down. But have a look at where the death rate is and that gives you your answer. Okay, even though that birth rate is dropping, it is still way higher than the death rate, and the death rate is dropping too. So that's going to mean that that total population carries on rising, because yes, there are fewer people being born, but there's still more people being born than there are dying, and also fewer people are dying over time as well. For the second one, you need to be suggesting reasons why birth rate has declined. So just think about over the passage of time and the passage of development, what kind of changes are taking place that would mean that birth rate was declining. And finally, it's a tricky question, this one, is to think what stage of the demographic transition model Kenya was in both 1945 and in 2000. So we need to look at what's going on. So in 1945 here, the birth rate is high and it's steady, okay? The death rate is beginning to come down. Our population is pretty low. So we need to look at the demographic transition model and see if we can see a time period, a stage where we've got a high steady birth rate, a pretty high death rate, and the population is low and pretty stable. And if we look back at it, okay, stage 1 is probably about the best fit, okay? We've got a high and pretty steady birth rate. The death rate is kind of a little bit high, okay, as compared to the graph we've just looked at there. We can see the death rate is here, but the population is low and stable. So the best fit we've got for that is for stage 1. So see if you can do that for 2000. Have a look at what's happening. What's happening with the population? Well, it's rising, still quite rapidly. What's happening with the birth rate? It's going down. What's happening with the death rate? It's going down. So have a look on that demographic transition model and see where you can see that pattern, that the population is rising pretty rapidly, your birth rate's coming down, your death rate's coming down, and see if you can establish what stage you think that's at. And then have a go at the challenge here, thinking about what the population pyramid would look like for Kenya in both 1945 and 2000. And once you've figured out what stage of the demographic transition model they're in at that time, you should be able to do that quite easily, simply by looking back at your table and having a look at which population pyramid you've drawn where. So with this slide, just have a read through it. You don't have to write out these paragraphs, although you can do if you want to. I've just noticed a little typo I've made. That should say write out the paragraphs. So sorry about that. So we've got here a population pyramid for Kenya that we are describing. So have a little read through these sections here and just think to yourself, you know, what is the correct answer here? Like I say, write it out if you want to, but you don't have to. Now here we've got population pyramids for two very different countries. We've got Mexico and we have got Japan, and they're at different times. So Mexico, we've got 1980 and 2015, and for Japan we have got 2015, and then we have got a prediction for 2050. And we can just see by looking at these population pyramids what problems these countries have got. So with the one from Mexico from 1980, a huge challenge, because look how wide this bottom is. Look at all those children who need to be educated, who need healthcare, but look how thin the amount of workers is as compared to that. So just by looking at this population pyramid, we know that the dependency ratio for young children is pretty high, and that's a challenge. Then we look at Japan. I mean, crikey, they've got a big problem coming on their hands. Look at how many old people there are, and all those people are going to need care. With old people in our healthcare system, we're very good at keeping people alive. We're not necessarily really good at keeping them healthy. So a lot of these people are going to need care. And again, it's a big dependency ratio for the workers below them. So what you need to do for this slide is, you know, take a copy of these population pyramids, or even just sketch them if you're doing your work on paper, and that's easier. And just label them up to show what is happening with birth rate, death rate and life expectancy on each one. So is the birth rate high or low? Is the death rate high or low? What's the life expectancy like? Are people living a long time? Are people living a short time? And how do you know from the changes you can see? So, for example, you might be putting something on Japan like a low birth rate, and you can tell that because the sides are really going in. Whereas on Mexico here, you've got a high birth rate, and you can tell that because the base where the young people are is really wide. So this table takes you through some of the advantages and disadvantages of the demographic transition model. So what we need to do, if you're doing your work on a computer, you need to maybe copy and paste this into your document. If you've got a printer at home and you're doing your work on paper and you want to print it out instead, you can do. But all you need to do is go through and colour code it to show which of these statements about the model are positives and which are negatives. So for example, this first one, it's dynamic and it shows change through time. That's a positive, okay? The fact that we can look at a model and use it to help us make a prediction about what might happen in a place and the population years in the future is a real positive. It helps governments make plans with things like healthcare provision and schooling. And whereas if we look at G, for example, that shows a disadvantage. The demographic transition model makes lots of assumptions. So it assumes that stage 3 follows several decades after stage 2, and that birth rate fell as a consequence of changes in death rate. That's not all the case. Sometimes birth rate can be affected by culture or access to birth control, or it can be government policy, such as with the China one-child policy. So we talked about that a little bit last lesson, where we said that demographic transition model, it can be a bit false in that it sort of imagines that all the countries of the world develop at the same speed and all sort of have the same cultural beliefs and all have the same political systems, and that's just not the case. So something to just sort of think about is which do you think is the most useful as a modelling tool? Is it the demographic transition model? Is it the population pyramid? Or do both have flaws? Or both have problems with them? So with that in mind, I'd like you to have a go at these two questions here. And that's to think about what this table is showing us about changes in birth rate and death rate with development or wealth. And we can see in the table here, for these different countries, we've got an idea of the development and wealth because we've got GNI per capita, okay? We've then got changes in birth rate and changes in death rate between 2004 and 2012. And so what we should see with the passage of time is birth rates and death rates coming down, and we should see the more wealthy countries having lower birth rates and lower death rates if we are following the demographic transition model. So this question isn't too hard, finding examples of countries that show birth rate and death rate change with development, okay? This one is difficult though, to give one example that doesn't show the normal movement through the demographic transition model. And what I'd like you to do is have a look at Brazil and Botswana. Okay, so for this second question, focus on these two. Look at how wealthy they are. Okay, so Botswana is making more money, GNI per capita, than Brazil. Okay, so Botswana, we've got nearly $14,000, whereas Brazil, we've only got 11,000. So financially, Botswana is the more developed country, it's better off. But then compare the birth rates and the death rates, okay? So Botswana is following the pattern in that its birth rate is coming down, but it's come down very slowly. It's only one different. The death rate has really gone down, okay? But compare that birth rate and death rate to Brazil, okay? Brazil isn't as wealthy, but look at how different that death rate is. They're kind of the opposite way round to what you would expect, okay? Because Botswana is more wealthy, you would expect it to have a far lower death rate than Brazil, but it hasn't. Brazil's is far lower, okay? And the same with the birth rate, okay? Having more money, you would expect that Botswana would have a lower birth rate, but it hasn't, okay? The birth rate is way higher. So that's one that doesn't follow the pattern of the demographic transition model very well at all. And we would need to investigate that further to find out why that was, that it was sort of bucking the trend of the idea of greater wealth and development, meaning that the birth rates and the death rates would be lower. So the final thing you need to do for me, and this is set as an assignment, you can think of it as homework if you like, is to have a go at this exam question. So you've got a table here showing you those figures for GNI per capita. You've got birth rate, death rate, etc. in 2004, 2012, and there are two questions for you to answer. To say what stage of the demographic transitional model Germany was in, and to justify your choice. Okay, so you have to make your decision. Is it stage 3? Is it stage 5? And you have to say why. So what's happening with those birth rates and death rates that made you make that choice? Okay, and then use this data to help you answer this. Okay, how can the demographic transition model be applied to countries at different levels of development? And it's one of these comment on the extent. So you are saying how much. So it's either, yes, I think it can always be applied. No, I don't think it can. Or sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. Sometimes other things are involved, like culture or politics. Okay, you can use some of the examples that we have talked about in the lesson today. If you're stuck with this, I still do expect you to have a go at it, okay? I will mark it for you, I will give you your feedback, but I don't want anyone to just not hand anything in because they couldn't do it. Try, okay? Even for this question, I want you to try. Finally, okay, just remind you that I want to see your completed work by the end of the day, okay, because you should be following your timetable. That shouldn't be a problem. I'll get that exam question marked and back to you as soon as I can, and do message me if you have got any problems. Okay, thanks for your attention, and drop me an email if you need any help at all. All right, bye.